Senator Hartke clearly has spent more time, more of his effort conducting hearings on auto and tire safety than any other senator in the U.S. Senate. And when all the other senators were not in attendance during the hearings on auto safety, he was. And he stayed throughout day after day conducting these hearings and asking questions. I don't think, and I have criticized the practice in the past, of accepting automobiles from the auto industry at very cheap leasing terms by members of Congress or members of the executive branch. But I think it's accurate to say that in Senator Hartke's case, it has not affected his interest in auto safety.
Does he have your support?
I don't endorse any candidates from whatever party. All I have said about Senator Hartke is that if you had to choose 5 senators in the U.S. Senate who have spent more time with issues of consumer safety, in his case, gas pipeline safety and auto and tire safety, he will stand in that rank.
Mr. Nader, referring to what you were speaking about a moment ago, at what point do you think local news media will be willing to not only name products, but name local names?
It would basically improve the market mechanism and consumer sovereignty and spur competition to higher quality at better prices. That's what it'll do. In fact, that's why it's opposed. Business is not so much opposed to Marxism or communism as they are to good old free enterprise, competitive business, and consumer sovereignty. That's what really gets them all worried. One can imagine what would happen if people could see what goes into their processed food products, or they could see what frauds so many of the so-called cleaners and cleaning agents are, and the kind of harm that's involved. Or they could see the enormous price fixing that goes on in the petroleum industry and in other industries that sell products to them. And the deliberate obfuscation or complexity of such services as insurance policies, so that the consumer couldn't possibly compare one policy with another to see which is the best buy.
Mr. Nader, concerning your investigation of the DuPont plant in Wilmington, Delaware, what is the nature of this investigation? What do you hope to find, and what have you found to date?
This is a group of 10 graduate students who are studying the impact of DuPont on Delaware. They are not studying so much DuPont's consumer goods or DuPont's impact on a nation and internationally. They're trying to ask the question, how does a company which dominates the state, economically and in many political ways, affect the state, affect the well-being of the state, affect the introduction of other industry into the state, affect the independence of the politics of the state, and affects the journalism in the state. The state of Delaware's 2 major papers are owned by DuPont.
What have they found initially?
They don't find anything initially. I don't think it's getting any better. In fact, the relationship to the amount of pollution right now is still much more correlative with economic growth than it is with pollution control systems. The laws are very weak. The penalties are even weaker. Picture the scene. You can destroy a body of water like Lake Erie and nothing happens to any of the polluters. You can destroy a beautiful spot on the west coast called the Santa Barbara offshore area, and there hasn't been any criminal prosecution or fine of the violators. There was recently a $1 million fine imposed on Chevron for the biggest oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. What is that? That's nothing. That's about an hour's gross revenue of the parent company. And it can be just passed on through the cartel in the form of higher consumer prices. Unless these fines go to the culpable officials, you're not going to get law acting as deterrents to future activity. And an oil spill is not just something that messes up beaches or kills a few seagulls. An oil spill, as we now know, due to testimony before the Senate a few weeks ago, breaks down almost immediately into carcinogenic components, which are consumed by fish and which can be passed through the food cycle. The oil spill also destroys almost every vestige of life on the seabed over an enormous area. And so it's a very serious ecological disaster, and one that does not repair itself in just a few months or even a few years.
Specifically in this area, some people have said there's a very tenuous relationship between what can be done to stop pollution and also what can be done as far as infringement upon individual and personal rights. Is there a middle ground that can be reached effectively?
should get together and make a study of property values and make a correlation. If it's a voice in the wilderness, it's still a voice. It's still an advocacy. It's still a disclosure of the bare facts.
Do you think the Nixon administration has been at all helpful or progressive in consumer affairs?
I tend not to indulge in commentary on partisan politics at all. But I think even a nonpartisan would have to conclude that the Republicans in this country have yet to know how to spell the name consumer.
What congressional action is pending right now, if any, and what support has it been receiving?
Two very important bills, far more important than any consumer bills ever proposed, and I'll explain why. The first bill is a bill to permit consumers to file consumer class actions in the federal courts. That simply means that a consumer with a grievance simply cannot command the interest of a lawyer or weather the attrition or delay of a court process. Consequently, if he has a grievance, say dealing with a mail order purchase, and if this abuse has been inflicted on, say, several 100,000 other consumers of the same national mail order house, this bill would allow him to go into federal court representing his $40 abuse and representing all the other consumers who are similarly abused. In this way, he will command the resources of the judicial system and the legal profession and be able to contend on a relatively equal basis with the large corporate defendant, which of course has all the resources to defend itself with. The second bill is to set up an Office of Consumer Protection with no regulatory powers, with only advocacy, investigatory, and disclosure powers. And that is precisely why the lobbies in Washington don't like it. They can always move their lobbies across the street and control a regulatory agency as they have the Interstate Commerce Commission or the Federal Power Commission, but they can't handle an agency that has nothing to offer them, that has no licenses, no adjudicatory power at all. Both these bills have been lobbied against by the White House, by Mr. Peter Flanagan, the chief advisor on these issues to the President, and ironically enough, even by Mrs. Virginia Nauer, who has been propelled against her will into a stance of opposing strong consumer legislation. And all along the country, and all through the country, the President administration is sending out its spokesman calling for law and order. But when millions of consumers are being given the opportunity to have access to the legal system, to have representation for interests that are not represented in government councils, the Nixon administration comes down hard and lobbies against it.
You think to avoid partisan politics, do not many of those against whom you...
Every time we start... in the crusade against unsafe automobiles, is there anything they can do?
One is they can first of all, any citizen can do something individually in terms of his individual behavior in the marketplace. Simply to stop being conned so easy, stop being bamboozled, stop being diverted away from the functional attributes of the vehicle, and to demand repeated and constant disclosure. For example, the kind of consumer manipulation that was made possible through the design of ornamental chrome eyebrows that we miscall bumpers is a reflection of really an incredible consumer apathy. And apathy is costing consumers about $1 billion a year in unnecessary repair costs to cars involved in collisions under 10 miles per hour. I think that's the first thing that can be done. The second is organize. Organize local consumer groups to work on local dealers and retailers, and organize on a national level. The third is to recognize that there are remedies in law, and that there will be increasingly remedies of law if they can require their political representatives to pass the laws that will at least open the doors to the courtroom in a practical and expeditious fashion. For example, members of Congress should be hearing loud and clear from consumers about these two consumer bills, the Consumer Class Action and the Consumer Protection Bill. In other words, although one can allocate responsibility on the shoulders of institutions that certainly know better, and should be less callous and indifferent, the fact is that when a situation deteriorates to the state that it has, the main responsibility in terms of pulling the country up by its own bootstraps has got to be on the shoulders of people. And the greater the number of people, the better.
The other day on NBC Monitor, you